Just a reminder that this is being shared with permission from Scholastic and will be taken down in June. Our riddle of the day for yesterday was, what can you catch but not throw? The answer is a cold. Your riddle of the day for today is, what begins with T, ends with T, and has T in it? I'm going to leave that there for you to think about. We're going to go ahead and read our two chapters today. We're reading chapters 43 and 44. Chapter 43 is called Over the Edge. The two waited all day in the rusty ruins, patches of sunlight crawling across the floor through the crumbling roof, like slow searchlights marking the hours. It took Tally ages to get to sleep, imagining the leap from the hilltop down into uncertainty. Finally she passed out, too tired to dream. Awakening at dusk, she found that David had already packed two knapsacks filled with everything they might need during the rescue. They hoverboarded to the edge of the ruins, riding two sandwiched hoverboards each. Hopefully, they would need the extra boards when they emerged from special circumstances, escapees in tow. Eating breakfast by the river, Tally took time to appreciate her sweet balls. If they got caught tonight, at least she would never have dehydrated food again. Sometimes Tally felt as if she'd almost accept brain damage if it meant a life without reconstituted noodles. As darkness fell, Tally and David reached the white water, and they passed through the green belt at the very moment that the lights winked off in Uglyville. By midnight, they were atop the hill overlooking special circumstances. Tally pulled out her binoculars and trained them inwards, towards New Prettytown, where the party towers were just coming alight. David blew onto his hands, and his breath visible in the October chill. You really think they'll do it? Why not, she said, watching the dark spaces of the city's largest pleasure garden. They seemed into it. Yeah, but aren't they taking a big risk? I mean, they just met us. She shrugged. An ugly lives for tricks. Haven't you ever done something just because a mysterious stranger intrigued you? I gave my gloves to one once, but it got me into all kinds of trouble. She lowered the binoculars and saw that David was smiling. You don't look as nervous tonight, she said. I'm glad we're finally here, finally ready to do something. And, and after those three kids agreed to help us, I feel like this might actually work? No, something better. He looked down at the special circumstances compound. They were so ready to help, just to make trouble, just to play a trick. At first, it killed me to hear you act like the smoke still existed. But if there are enough uglies like them, maybe it will again. Of course it will, she said softly. David shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. But even if we blow it tonight, and both wind up under the knife, at least somebody will still keep fighting. Making trouble, you know? I hope it's us, making trouble, Tally said. Me too. He drew Tally closer and kissed her. When he released her, Tally drew a deep breath and closed her eyes. It felt better to kiss him, more real, now that she was about to begin undoing the damage she had done. Look, David said. In the dark spaces of New Prettytown, something was happening. She raised her binoculars. The shimmering light cut its way across the black expanse of the pleasure garden, like a bright fissure opening up into the earth. Then more lines appeared, one by one, tremulous arcs and circles sweeping across the darkness. The various segments seemed to sparkle into existence in random order, but eventually they formed letters and words. Finally, the whole glittering thing was finished. Some parts of it newly sprung to life, the first few lines already starting to fade as the sparklers exhausted themselves. But for a few moments Tally could read the whole thing, even without her binoculars. From Uglyville it must have looked huge, visible to anyone staring longingly out of their window. It said, "The smoke lives." As Tally watched it fade, breaking down into random lines and arcs again as the sparklers extinguished, she wondered if the words were really true. There they go, David said. Below them, a large circular opening had appeared in the largest building's roof, and three hover cars rose up through the gap in quick succession, screaming towards the city. Tally hoped that Anne, Dex, and Sussy had followed her advice and were long gone from New Prettytown. Ready, she said. In answer, David tightened the straps of his bungee jacket and jumped onto his boards. They rode down the hill, turned around, and started back up. For the 10th time, Tally checked the light on the collar of her jacket. It was still green, and she could see David's light bobbing along beside her. No excuses now. They gained speed as they climbed towards the dark sky, the entire hill like a giant ramp before them. The wind pushed Tally's hair back, and she blinked as bugs pinged across her face. She slid carefully towards the front of the pared boards, the toes of one grippy shoe sticking out past the riding surface. Then the horizon seemed to slip away in front of her, and Tally crouched, ready to jump. The ground disappeared. Tally pushed off with all her strength, forcing her hoverboards down the steep side of the hill, where they would bring themselves to a halt. She and David had switched off their crash bracelets. They didn't want the boards following them over the wire. Not yet. Tally soared into midair, still climbing for a few more seconds. The outer city lay below her, a vast patchwork of dark and light. She spread her arms and legs. At the peak of her arc, the silence seemed to overwhelm everything. Her stomach churning weightlessness, the mix of excitement and fear rushing through her, and the wind against her face. Tally tore her eyes from the silently waiting earth and dared a glance at David. Hardly an arm's length away, he was looking back at her, his face alight. She grinned at him and turned back to see that the ground was approaching now, the speed of her fall building slowly. As she had calculated, they were coming down right in the middle of the wire. Tally began to anticipate the sickening jolt of her bungee jacket pulling her up. For long moments nothing happened, except the ground getting closer, and Tally wondered again if bungee jackets could handle a fall from this distance. 100 versions of what a hard landing would feel like managed to squeeze into her head. Of course, it probably wouldn't feel like anything, ever again. The ground grew closer and closer until Tally was certain that something had gone wrong. Then, with sudden violence, the strap of the jacket came alive, cutting cruelly into her thighs and shoulders, crushing the air from her lungs, and the pressure building as if a huge rubber band were wrapped around her, trying to bring everything to a halt. The bare dirt of the compound rushed up towards her, looking flat and packed and hard, and the jacket fighting her momentum desperately now, crushing her like a fist in its grasp. Finally, the invisible rubber band stretching towards its breaking point, stretching towards its breaking point. She slowed to a shuddering halt within reach of the ground, pulling her hands back to keep from touching it, her eyeballs straining forward as if they wanted to pop out of her skull. Then her fall reversed, and she pulled back upwards, hover bouncing head over heels, sky and horizon spinning around her like a playground ride. Tally had no idea where David was, or where up or down were, for that matter. This jump was 10 times her plunge off Garbo Mansion. How many bounces would it take to come to a stop? Now she was falling again, the dirt of the compound replaced by a building below her. One foot almost touched down onto the roof, but Tally was pulled up again, still barreling forward with the momentum of her leap off the hill. She managed to orient herself, sorting out up and down just in time to see the edge of the roof coming towards her. She was overshooting the building. Flailing at the grasp of the jacket, flying helplessly upwards and down again, she passed the roof's edge, but her outstretched hand caught the rain gutter, bringing Tally to a sudden halt. "Phew!" she said, looking down. The building wasn't very tall, and Tally would bounce in her jacket if she fell, but the moment her feet touched the ground, the wire would sound an alarm. She gripped the rain gutter with both hands. But the bungee jacket, satisfied that her fall had stopped, was shutting itself down, gradually returning to her normal weight. She struggled to pull herself up onto the roof, but the heavy knapsack full of rescue equipment dragged her downward. It was like trying to do a pull-up wearing lead shoes. She hung there, out of ideas, waiting to fall. Footsteps came towards her on the roof, a face appearing. "David." "Having trouble?" She grunted an answer, and he reached over, grabbing the strap of the knapsack. The weight mercifully lifted from her shoulders, and Tally pulled herself over the edge. David sat back onto the roof, shaking his head. "So, Tally, you're used to that for fun?" "Not every day." "Didn't think so. Can we rest a minute?" She scanned the rooftop. No one was coming, no alarms ringing. Apparently the wire wasn't built to sense them up there. Tally smiled. "Sure, take 2 minutes if you want. It looks like the specials weren't expecting anyone to jump out of the sky." Next chapter, Inside. The roof of Special Circumstances had looked flat and featureless from way up on the hill top. But standing on it, Tally could see the air vents, antennas, maintenance hatchways, and of course, the big circular door that the hover cars had come through, now closed. It was a wonder that neither her nor David had cracked their heads hover bouncing across it. "So how do we get in?" David asked. "We should start with this." She pointed towards the hover car door. Don't you think they'll notice if we come through here and we're not in a hover car? Agreed. But what if we jam the door? If any more specials show up, we don't want to make it easy for them to come in after us. Good idea. David searched through his knapsack, bringing out what looked like a tube of hair gel. He squeezed out white goo along the edges of the door, careful not to let any of it touch his fingers. What's that? Glue, the nano kind. You can stick your shoes to the ceiling with this stuff and hang upside down. Tally's eyes widened. She'd heard rumors of tricks you could play with nano glue, but Uglies weren't allowed to requisition it. Tell me you haven't done that. He smiled. I had to leave 'em up there. Waste of good shoes. So how do we get down? Tally pulled the power jack from her pack and pointed. We take the elevator. The big metal box sticking up from the roof looked like a storage shed, but the double doors and eye reader gave it away. Tally squinted, making sure the reader didn't flash her. Worked her power jack between the doors, they crumpled like foil. Through the doors, a dark shaft dropped away into nothingness. Tally clicked her tongue, and the echoes indicated that it was a long way down. She glanced at her color, light, still green. Tally turned to David. Wait for me to whistle, then stepped off into thin air. Falling down the shaft was much scarier than leaping off Garbo Mansion, or even flying into the space from the hilltop. The darkness offered no clue to how deep the shaft was, and it felt to Tally as if she might fall forever. She sensed the walls rushing past, and wondered if she was drifting towards one side as she fell, about to crash against it. She imagined herself bouncing from one wall to another all the way down, coming to a soft landing, already broken and bleeding. Tally kept her arms close to her sides. At least she was sure the jacket would work in here. Elevators used the same magnetic lifters that as any other hovercraft, so there was always a solid metal plate at the bottom. After a long count of 5, the jacket gripped Tally. She bounced twice, straight up and down, then settled onto a hard surface, and found herself in silence and absolute blackness. Stretching out her hands, she felt the 4 walls around her. Nothing suggested the inside of closed doors. Her finger came away greasy. Tally peered upwards. A tiny shaft of light shone above, and she could just make out David's face peering below. She pursed her lips to whistle, but stopped. A muffled sound came from the floor beneath her feet. Someone talking. She crouched, trying to grasp the words, but all Tally could hear was the razor sound of the cruel pretty's voice. The mocking tone reminded her of Dr. Cable. Without warning, the floor dropped out from under her, and Tally struggled to keep her footing. When the elevator stopped again, one of her ankles twisted painfully under her weight, but she managed not to fall. The sound below her faded. One thing was certain now, the complex wasn't empty. Tally lifted her head and whistled, then huddled in one corner of the shaft, hands covering her head, counting. 5 seconds later, a pair of feet dangled next to her, then jerked back up, the beam of David's flashlight swinging around drunkenly. Gradually, he settled down beside her. Wow, it's dark down here. Shh, she hissed. He nodded, sweeping the flashlight around the shaft. Just above them, it fell on the inside of closed doors. Of course, standing on the elevator's roof, they were midway between floors. Tally interlaced her fingers, locking her hands together to give David a boost up where he could wedge the power jack between the doors. They crumpled open with a metal screech that set her hair on end. He pulled himself through, then extended his hand back down to her. Tally grabbed it and pulled, her grippy shoes squeaking on the walls of the elevator shaft like a herd of panicked mice. Everything was making too much noise. The hallway was dark. Tally tried to convince herself that no one had heard them yet. Maybe this whole floor was empty at night. She pulled out her own flashlight, pointing it at the doors as they walked down the hall. Small brown labels marked each of them. Radiology, neurology, magnetic imaging, she read softly. Operating theater 2. She looked at David. He shrugged and gave the door a push. It opened. I guess when you're in an underground bunker, there's no point in locking up, he said softly. After you. Tally crept inside. The room was big, and the walls lined with dark and silent machines. An operating tank stood in the middle, the liquid drained out of it, tubes and electrodes hanging loosely in a puddle at the bottom. A metal table glistened with cruel shapes of knives and vibrosols. This looks like photos Mom showed me, David said. They do the operation here. Tally nodded. Doctors only put you in a tank if they were doing major surgery. Maybe this is where they make specials. Special, she said. The thought didn't cheer her up. They returned to the hall a few doors later and found a room labeled morgue. Do you? She started to ask. David shook his head. No. They searched the rest of the floor. Basically, it was a small, well-equipped hospital, but there were no torture chambers or prison cells, and no smokies. Where to now? Well, Tally said, if you were the evil Dr. Cable, where would you put your prisoners? The evil who? Oh, that's her name. The woman who runs this place. I remember from when I got busted. David frowned, and Tally wondered if she'd said too much. Then he shrugged. I guess I'd put them in the dungeons. Okay, down then. They found a set of fire stairs that led down, but they ended after only one flight. Apparently, they'd reached the bottom of special circumstances. Careful, Tally whispered. Before I heard people getting out of the elevator below me. They must be somewhere down here. This floor was lit by a soft glow strip running down the middle of the hallway. A cold finger crept down Tally's spine as she read the labels on one door. Interrogation room 1, interrogation room 2, isolation room 1, she whispered, her flashlight flickering across the words like an anxious firefly. Disorientation room 1. Oh, David, they must be down here somewhere. He nodded and pushed open one of the doors softly, but it didn't budge. He ran his fingers around the edge, searching for a place where a power jack could get purchased. Don't let the eye reader flash you, Tally warned softly. She pointed at the little camera by the door. If it thinks it sees an eye, it'll read your iris and check with its big computer. It won't have any record of me, and that will totally freak it out. Just don't get too close. It's automatic. Okay, David said, nodding. These doors are too smooth anyways. No place to fit a jack in. Let's keep looking. Farther down the hall, a label caught Tally's eye. Long-term detention, she whispered. The door had a long expanse of blank wall on either side, as if the room behind it was bigger than the others. She put her ear to it, listening to the hint of sound. She heard a familiar voice. It was coming closer. David, she hissed, pulling away from the door and throwing herself against the wall. David looked around frantically for a place to hide. Both of them were in plain view. The door slid open and Dr. Cable's malevolent voice poured out. You're simply not trying hard enough. You just have to convince her that. Dr. Cable, Tally said. The woman spun to face Tally, her hawk-like features twisted in surprise. I thought I'd give myself up. Tally Youngblood? How? From behind, David's power jack thudded against the side of Dr. Cable's head, and she slumped to the floor. Is she? David stammered, his face white. Tally knelt and turned Dr. Cable's head to inspect the wound. No blood, but she was out cold. No matter how formidable cruel pretties were, surprise still had its advantages. She'll be okay. Dr. Cable, what's going? Tally turned towards the voice, her eyes taking in the young woman before her. She was tall and elegant, every feature perfection. Her eyes, deep and soulful, flecked with copper and gold, widened with a troubled look. Her generous lips parted wordlessly, and she raised one graceful hand. Tally's heart almost stopped at the beauty of her confusion. Then recognition filled the woman's face, her broad smile illuminating the darkness. And Tally felt herself smiling in return. It felt good to make this woman happy. Tally, it is you! It was Shay. She was pretty. And that's the end of our chapters for today. Tune in tomorrow for the next ones. Bye!